David had been working at the radio telescope for almost 4 years now. Every night, he would drive his old Honda to the observatory, clock in at midnight, and spend the next 8 hours listening to the universe. His job was simple. Check the equipment, monitor the signals, make sure everything kept running smoothly while the day shift scientists were home sleeping. Most people thought his job was boring. His mom always asked when he was going to find something better. Friends from college had moved on to fancy office jobs in the city, but David loved what he did. There was something magical about being alone with the giant dish pointed at the stars. Knowing that somewhere out there, signals were traveling through space that might change everything. Tonight felt different, though. The air was unusually still, and even the usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic seemed muted. David was sipping his third cup of coffee when he noticed the lights in the parking lot flickering. He looked up from his monitor, expecting to see a car pulling in, maybe his supervisor making one of his random check-ins. Instead, he saw something that made him spill coffee all over his keyboard. A craft was landing in the parking lot. Not a helicopter or plane, but something that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a science fiction movie. The ship was sleek and silver, about the size of a small bus, and it moved without making any sound at all. As it touched down, the metal seemed to ripple like water, and soft blue lights pulsed along its edges. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He'd dreamed about this moment his entire life. First contact with beings from another world. But now that it was happening, he felt frozen in place. His hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, then stopped. Who would he call? Who would believe him? The ship's door opened with a soft whoosh, and David held his breath. Out stepped what looked like a teenager, but definitely not human. The being had smooth, pale blue skin that seemed to glow faintly in the parking lot lights. His eyes were the most striking feature. They swirled with colors like tiny galaxies, constantly shifting between deep purple and bright silver. His hair was white as snow and seemed to float slightly, as if he was underwater. But what really caught David's attention was the attitude. Even from 50 feet away, he could see the way the alien carried himself, chin up, shoulders back, like he owned the place, like he owned the planet. He wore robes that changed color as he moved, shifting from deep blue to silver to purple. And floating above his head was some kind of crown made of pure light. David slowly stood up and walked outside. His legs felt wobbly, like he was walking on a boat in rough water. This was it, the moment that would change human history forever. He tried to think of something profound to say, something worthy of this incredible moment. The alien spotted him immediately and walked over with quick, confident steps. Up close, David could see that despite his otherworldly appearance, the being really did look like a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old by human standards. But there was something ancient in those swirling eyes, something that suggested he'd seen things David couldn't even imagine. "You," the alien said, and his voice was like nothing David had ever heard. It was definitely speaking English, but with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Are you the primitive life form in charge of this establishment?" David blinked, trying to process what he'd just heard. The alien gestured dismissively at the massive radio telescope behind them, and David realized he was being asked a question. I'm just the night technician," he managed to say. "Are you really from another planet?" The alien's expression grew even more disdainful. "Prince Zephyrian of the Andorian Empire," he announced, as if David should already know who he was. "Heir to 17 star systems and commander of fleets that span galaxies. And you are? David Kim?" The prince, because apparently that's what he was, looked David up and down like he was examining a bug under a microscope. David Kim, how wonderfully ... ordinary. There was something in the way he said it that made David's stomach clench. This wasn't how first contact was supposed to go. In all the movies and books, the aliens were either wise and peaceful or dangerous and hostile. Nobody had prepared him for an alien teenager with an attitude problem. David tried to stay calm. Maybe this was just a cultural misunderstanding. Maybe aliens had different ways of showing respect. "I'll come to Earth," he said, trying to sound official. Observatory. We use this telescope to listen for signals from space. Prince Zephyrian let out a sound that might have been laughter, but not the good kind. Listen for signals? With this ancient contraption, he walked over to the base of the telescope and tapped it with one finger, making a ringing sound. We've been receiving your pathetic radio waves for centuries. Your music, your television broadcasts, your desperate attempts to reach out to the cosmos. The prince's floating crown pulsed brighter, and David could see his own reflection in its light. I came here expecting to meet Earth's greatest minds. Perhaps negotiate a cultural exchange with your most advanced specimens. He paused, and his galaxy eyes fixed on David with obvious disappointment. Instead, I find you, a night shift. Nobody playing with obsolete equipment. David felt heat rising in his cheeks. He'd spent years of his life dedicated to the search. For extraterrestrial intelligence, he'd given up better-paying jobs, ignored his family's concerns, and devoted himself to this work because he believed it mattered. And now, when that search had finally succeeded, he was being treated like he was worthless. But he didn't say any of that. He just stood there, watching as the prince continued his inspection of the facility, making small sounds of disgust at everything he saw. The alien moved like he was touring a museum of primitive artifacts, touching equipment with just the tip of one finger, as if afraid it might contaminate him. "Do you have any idea?" the prince said, turning back to David. "How far I've traveled to get here? How many important duties I've neglected? How many galactic councils I've missed?" His voice was rising now, and the harmonics were getting stronger. "I crossed 2.3 million light-years, because our deep space monitors detected what we thought might be an emerging civilization, a species worth making contact with." David opened his mouth to respond, but the prince wasn't finished. "Look at you," Zephyrian continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Standing there in your stained uniform, your simple human features, your limited lifespan written in every line of your face. You can't even comprehend the technology that brought me here, can you?" The words hit David like physical blows. He'd always been proud of his work, proud of humanity's achievements in reaching out to the stars. But now, seeing himself through the eyes of this cosmic prince, he felt small and insignificant. "Your entire species," the prince went on, "is nothing more than cosmic background noise. Barely evolved apes who've learned to flip switches and pretend they understand the universe." David's hands were clenched into fists now, but he kept them at his sides. He thought about all the scientists who had worked at this facility, all the discoveries that had been made, all the knowledge that had been gained. He thought about humanity's dreams of finding life among the stars, and how those dreams had just been crushed by a spoiled alien teenager. Prince Zephyrian stepped closer, and David could smell something like ozone and starlight. "You're not just primitive David Kim," the prince whispered, his voice somehow carrying more venom than if he'd been shouting. "You're irrelevant. Your whole planet is irrelevant. We've wasted my time coming here." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft humming of the telescope's machinery and the distant sound of the prince's ship. David stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of every word, every insult, every dismissal of everything. He'd worked for then, without saying a word, turned around and walked away. His footsteps echoed in the quiet night air as he headed toward the parking lot, leaving the prince standing alone beside his gleaming ship. He didn't look back, didn't offer any explanation or defense. He just walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the facility's lights. Behind him, Prince Zephyrian stood in stunned silence, staring at the spot where the human had been. The first time in his long life, someone had simply refused to engage with him. Someone had chosen to walk away rather than argue, plead, or try to impress him. And for reasons he couldn't understand, that simple act of quiet dignity left him feeling more confused than he'd ever felt before. Prince Zephyrian watched David disappear into the darkness, expecting him to come back any second. In his experience, lesser beings always returned, usually with apologies, desperate explanations, or pathetic attempts to win his favor. But the minutes ticked by and the human was nowhere to be seen. This had never happened before. Not once in his 127 years of life had anyone simply walked away from him. The prince felt something strange stirring in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. Was it confusion, curiosity, or something else? Entirely, he shook his head, trying to dismiss the unfamiliar emotion. The human was clearly just too primitive to understand proper protocol when meeting galactic royalty. That had to be it. There was no other explanation that made sense. The prince began walking around the observatory complex, his floating crown casting shifting shadows on the ground. Everything about this place screamed primitive technology to him. The metal structures looked crude and bulky compared to the sleek designs his people had mastered thousands of years ago. The electrical systems hummed with inefficient energy patterns that made his sensitive hearing ache. But as he examined the equipment more closely, something unexpected began to happen. Despite its primitive appearance, everything was meticulously maintained. Every surface was clean, every connection was secure, every component was functioning at peak efficiency. Someone had been taking extraordinary care of this ancient machinery. The prince found himself thinking about the human who had walked away. David Kim, the night technician who had introduced himself with such simple dignity before being thoroughly insulted and dismissed. What kind of person dedicated their life to maintaining equipment that was laughably outdated by galactic standards? The Zephyrians. Advisors finally emerged from the ship, having remained hidden during the initial encounter. His chief counselor, an elderly being named Viridian, approached with careful steps. Your Highness, Viridian spoke through their telepathic link, his mental voice carrying decades of diplomatic experience. The human's reaction was quite unexpected. In all our cultural studies, we've never encountered a species that responds to authority with such ... indifference. It wasn't indifference, Zephyrian replied, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to correct his advisor. It was something else. Perhaps we should depart, Your Highness. This civilization appears to be even more primitive than our initial assessment suggested, but Zephyrian found himself reluctant to leave. Something about the human's quiet dignity had gotten under his skin. The way David had stood there, taking every insult without fighting back, without trying to prove himself, without even getting angry, just absorbing it all, and then choosing to walk away. We'll remain for a few more days, the prince announced. I want to observe their behavior patterns more closely. Viridian's mental voice carried a note of concern. Your Highness, the Galactic Council is expecting your report on the trade negotiations with the Centauri systems. We really should. The Centauri can wait, Zephyrian interrupted. This is more important. Though he couldn't have explained why it felt important, even to himself. Meanwhile, David was walking along the dark road toward his apartment. His mind strangely calm, despite everything that had just happened. He dreamed about meeting aliens. His entire life, but never like this. Never with such casual cruelty and dismissal. The funny thing was, he wasn't even angry anymore. The initial sting of the prince's words had faded into something more like disappointment. Not disappointment in the alien. He was clearly just a spoiled kid who'd never learned basic courtesy. But disappointment in how the encounter had gone. David had always imagined that first contact would be profound, meaningful, maybe even life-changing. Instead, it had been like dealing with the worst kind of customer at a retail job, someone who looked down on you just because of where you worked. As he reached his small apartment, David realized something that surprised him. He didn't feel diminished by what had happened. The prince's words had been meant to make him feel small and worthless, but they'd actually had the opposite effect. It reminded him why he loved his work. He wasn't searching for aliens to impress them or gain their approval. He was doing it because the universe was vast and wonderful and full of mysteries waiting to be discovered. Whether some cosmic teenager thought humanity was primitive or not, didn't change the beauty of Saturn's rings or the majesty of distant galaxies. David made himself a simple dinner and sat by his window, looking up at the stars, somewhere out. There, Prince Zephyrian was probably preparing to leave Earth, convinced that he'd wasted his time visiting a planet full of insignificant primitives. And maybe from his perspective, that was true. But David knew something the prince didn't understand. Being primitive wasn't the same as being worthless. Every species had to start somewhere. Humanity was young compared to galactic civilizations, but that didn't make their achievements meaningless. The radio telescope that the prince had dismissed so casually represented thousands of years of human curiosity and ingenuity. It was built by people who looked up at the stars and refused to accept that they were alone in the universe. It was maintained by people like David, who believed that listening for signals from space was worth dedicating their lives to. Back at the observatory, Prince Zephyrian was having trouble sleeping. His ship's sleeping chambers were designed for perfect comfort, with climate control that could replicate the conditions of any planet in the galaxy, but he found himself tossing and turning, unable to get the image of David Kim out of his mind. The human had looked so ordinary, average height. Dark hair, simple clothes, nothing remarkable about him at all. But there had been something in his eyes, something that Zephyrian couldn't quite define. A quiet strength, maybe, or a sense of purpose that didn't depend on external validation. The prince had met kings and emperors from dozens of worlds. He'd negotiated with beings who controlled entire star systems and commanded fleets that could destroy planets. But none of them had ever responded to his presence the way David had. With such complete and dignified indifference, most people either feared him or tried to impress him. They cowered before his royal status or attempted to win his favor through flattery and gifts. But David had done neither. He'd simply listened to the insults, absorbed them without comment, and then chosen to remove himself from the situation. Zephyrian was beginning to realize the most powerful response anyone had ever given him. Not because it was dramatic or confrontational, but because it was so completely unbothered. David hadn't tried to prove the prince wrong or defend his species' honor. He'd just decided that the conversation wasn't worth having and walked away. The prince found himself wondering what David was doing right now. Was he telling everyone about the encounter? Was he calling government officials or scientists? Was he trying to figure out how to contact the ship? But somehow, Zephyrian doubted it. Something about the human's quiet dignity suggested that he wouldn't be rushing to share the story with anyone. He'd probably just go back to his normal life, back to his work maintaining that primitive but carefully tended equipment. For the first time in his long life, Prince Zephyrian found himself genuinely curious about someone else's perspective. What did the universe look like through David Kim's eyes? What did it feel like to be part of a young species, still reaching out to the stars with hope and wonder? The questions kept him awake until dawn, staring out at the unfamiliar constellations of Earth's night sky, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life by dismissing the quiet human who had simply walked away. 3 days had passed since the encounter, and Prince Zephyrian was still on Earth. His ship remained hidden in a cloaked field just beyond the observatory, invisible to human detection systems, but close enough for him to observe the strange planet that had produced such an unexpected response to his presence. He told his advisors that he was conducting important research on primitive civilizations, but the truth was far more complicated. The prince couldn't stop thinking about David Kim. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the human's face in that final moment, not angry, not frightened, not even disappointed, just quietly dignified as he turned and walked away. It was driving him crazy, Your Highness. Viridian's mental voice interrupted his thoughts. The Galactic Council has sent 3 messages requesting your presence at the Trade Summit. The ambassadors from the Rigel system are beginning to ask questions about your absence. Zephyrian waved dismissively. Tell them I'm dealing with a potential security threat. A new species that requires careful evaluation. Is that what we're calling this? Viridian's tone carried just enough concern to be respectful, but questioning. The prince didn't answer. Instead, he activated his ship's advanced scanning systems and began tracking David's daily routine. If he was going to understand what had happened during their encounter, he needed to learn more about this puzzling human. What he discovered over the next few days challenged everything. He thought he knew about primitive species. David Kim lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy or impressive. But the prince watched through his ship's sensors as the human went about his daily life. What he saw was fascinating in ways he hadn't expected. Every morning, David would wake up early and spend an hour reading. Not entertainment programs or mindless digital content, but actual books thick volumes about physics, astronomy, philosophy, and history. The prince was surprised to discover that despite his primitive technology, the human was constantly learning, constantly trying to understand more about the universe around him. After his reading time, David would often walk to a local school where he volunteered as a tutor. Zephyrian watched through the school's windows as the human patiently explained basic mathematics and science to young children. The kids clearly loved him. They would light up when he entered the room, gathering around him with excited questions. About space and stars, the prince found himself leaning forward, studying David's face as he answered each question with genuine enthusiasm. Here was someone who got excited about teaching 8-year-olds why the sky was blue, who could spend 20 minutes explaining how telescopes work to a group of giggling children. There was something pure about that kind of joy and sharing. Knowledge. In the afternoons, David would run errands around town. The prince watched him help an elderly woman carry her groceries to her car, spend time at an animal shelter walking dogs that needed exercise, and stop by a community center where he helped serve meals to people who couldn't afford them. None of these activities were remarkable by galactic standards. There was no advanced technology involved, no great scientific breakthroughs, no contributions to interstellar civilization. But there was something about the way David approached each task that made the prince pay closer attention. The human never seemed to do things for recognition or reward. He didn't take pictures of his volunteer work to share on social media. He didn't tell people about his good deeds or expect praise for helping others. He just quietly went about making his small corner of the world a little bit better. Most interesting of all was David's behavior at work. Every night he would drive to the observatory in his old car, clock in with a smile for the security guard, spend the next 8 hours tending to equipment that was laughably primitive by galactic standards. But he treated every piece of machinery like it was the most important. Technology in the universe. The prince watched David calibrate instruments with the same careful attention that royal engineers gave to faster-than-light engines. He saw him spend hours analyzing data that contained no alien signals, no groundbreaking discoveries, just the normal background noise of space. And yet the human approached each night's work with the same quiet dedication, as if he truly believed that tonight might be the night humanity finally heard from the stars. What really got to? Prince Zephyrian was David's attitude toward failure. Most nights, the telescope detected nothing unusual, just the ordinary radio waves from distant galaxies. The predictable signals from known pulsars, the endless static of cosmic background radiation. By any measure, these were unsuccessful nights. No aliens contacted Earth, no new civilizations announced themselves, no great discoveries were made, but David never seemed discouraged. He would carefully log each night's observations, maintain the equipment with the same meticulous care, and return the next night ready to listen again. The prince began to realize that, for this human, the search itself was the purpose. The act of reaching out to the universe with hope and curiosity was valuable, regardless of the results. It was a completely foreign concept to Zephyrian. In his world, actions were judged by their outcomes. Success meant conquest, profit, or political advantage. The idea of finding meaning in the attempt itself, regardless of the result, was something he'd never encountered before. Most disturbing of all was David's reaction to the encounter with the prince, or rather his complete lack of reaction. The human had never told anyone about meeting an alien, didn't call government officials or scientists, he didn't try to prove what had happened or seek recognition for being the first human to make contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. He just went back to his normal life as if nothing had happened. The prince found this behavior absolutely baffling. This was potentially the most important event in human history, and David was treating it like it was just another Tuesday night at work. Why wasn't he trying to capitalize on the encounter? Why wasn't he seeking fame or fortune, or at least some acknowledgement of what he'd experienced? Through his ship's sensors, Zephyrian watched David work night after night, maintaining the same quiet routine, showing the same patient dedication to his task. The human had been insulted by galactic royalty, dismissed as primitive and irrelevant. And yet he continued his work with the same calm purpose as before. It was as if David's sense of self-worth came from somewhere internal, somewhere that couldn't be touched by external validation or criticism. The prince had tried to diminish him, to make him feel small and worthless. But somehow the human had remained completely unaffected. For someone who had spent his entire life believing that worth was determined by power, technology, and recognition. This was a revelation that shook him to his core. David Kim was nobody special by galactic standards, just a night shift technician on a primitive planet. But he possessed something that Prince Zephyrian, with all his advanced technology and royal authority, was beginning to realize he lacked. The human had found a way to live with purpose and dignity that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. He had discovered meaning in simple acts of service, joy in sharing knowledge, and satisfaction in work that others might consider mundane. As the prince watched David begin another night shift, he was carefully checking each piece of equipment with the same patient attention he'd shown for years. Zephyrian felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine respect for someone he'd initially dismissed as primitive. And for the first time in his long life, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was the one who had something to learn. By the end of the first week, Prince Zephyrian had developed what his advisors were calling an unhealthy obsession with the human night technician. Every day brought new observations that challenged his understanding of what it meant to be civilized. Today was different, though. Instead of watching from his ship's sensors, the prince had decided to get closer. Using his people's advanced camouflage technology, he made himself invisible and followed David through his daily routine. What he witnessed would change everything. He thought he knew about intelligence and worth. The morning started at the elementary school where David volunteered. Zephyrian followed invisibly as the human entered a classroom full of children around 8 or 9 years old. A teacher, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, smiled when she saw him. "Good, David's here," she announced to the class. "Who remembers what we learned about space last week?" Immediately, tiny hands shot up around the room. The prince watched in fascination as David sat cross-legged on the floor, letting the children gather around him in a circle. There was something magical about the way the kids responded to him. They treated him like he was the most important person in the world. "Mr. David," a little girl with pigtails asked, "is it true that there are really aliens out there?" The prince tensed, wondering how David would answer. Would he tell them about their encounter? Would he use this moment to become famous? David smiled gently. "Well, Lily, the universe is huge, bigger than we can even imagine. There are billions and billions of stars out there, and many of them probably have planets just like Earth. So it's very likely that somewhere out there, other living beings are looking up at the stars and wondering the same thing we are." "We alone? Have you ever seen an alien?" asked a boy with freckles. David paused for just a moment, and the prince held his breath. "Not yet," David said finally. "But I keep looking and listening, just in case they're trying to talk to us." Prince felt something twist in his chest. David could have told them yes. He could have described meeting galactic royalty, could have made himself the center of the most important story in human history. But instead, he was protecting both the children's sense of wonder and the prince's privacy. For the next hour, Zephyrian watched David explain complicated concepts in ways that 8-year-olds could understand. He used simple comparisons, describing the solar system by comparing planets to different-sized balls, explaining gravity by talking about why things fall down instead of floating away. The children hung on every word, asking questions that David answered with infinite patience. What struck the prince most was how David never talked down to them. He didn't treat their questions as silly or unimportant. When a boy asked why stars twinkle, David took the time to explain atmospheric distortion using the example of looking at something underwater. When a girl wondered if aliens would be friendly, he talked about how different cultures on Earth had learned to get along despite their differences. The important thing, David told them, is to always stay curious. Keep asking questions. Keep learning. Keep wondering about the amazing universe we live in. Every single one of you might discover something incredible someday. After school, the prince followed David to the community center, where he helped serve lunch to people who were struggling financially. Zephyrian had never seen poverty up close before, His royal status had insulated him from such realities. But here was David, treating every person with the same respect he'd shown the children. Listening to their stories, remembering their names, asking about their families. An elderly man with weathered hands told David about his grandson who wanted to be an astronaut. A single mother mentioned her daughter's science fair project about the moon. A teenager talked about wanting to study physics, but worrying about college costs. David listened to each story with genuine interest, offering encouragement and sometimes practical advice about scholarships or educational resources. The prince realized that David wasn't just serving food, he was serving hope. He was treating each person like they mattered, like their dreams and struggles were important. There was no judgment, no condescension. It's just human kindness extended to people who probably didn't receive much of it elsewhere. That evening, Scifi followed David to the animal shelter. The prince had never understood the human fascination with keeping other species as companions. But watching David interact with the abandoned dogs and cats was enlightening. He spent time with each animal, especially the older ones that were less likely to be adopted. He would sit quietly with a scared cat until it felt safe enough to purr, or patiently walk an elderly dog who moved slowly but desperately needed exercise. You know, these creatures will never be able to repay your kindness, Scifi found himself thinking. They can't advance your career or improve your social status. They can't even understand the concept of gratitude the way more intelligent beings would. But as he watched David gently brush a one-eyed cat while talking to it in soothing tones, the prince began to understand that repayment wasn't the point. David wasn't being kind because he expected something in return. He was being kind because that's who he was. The revelation hit Scifi like a physical blow. Throughout his long life, every relationship had been transactional. People were nice to him because he was royalty. They gave him gifts because they wanted political favors. He praised his intelligence because they hoped for advancement in his empire. He had never experienced kindness for its own sake, but David showed the same gentle care to homeless cats that he showed two brilliant children, the same respect to struggling families that he showed to fellow scientists. His kindness wasn't based on what someone could do for him. It was based on the simple recognition that all living beings deserved compassion. That night, as David began his shift at the observatory, the prince watched him perform his routine. Maintenance with the same careful attention he'd observed all week. But now Scifi saw it differently. This wasn't primitive technology being operated by an inferior being. This was a monument to human hope and curiosity, maintained by someone who understood its true value. David cleaned each component with the reverence of someone tending a sacred flame. He checked every connection like he was caring for something precious. He analyzed each night's data with the patience of someone who believed that persistence and dedication were more important than immediate results. As the night wore on, the prince found himself thinking about his own life. He commanded fleets and ruled star systems, but when was the last time he had personally helped someone who couldn't help him back? When had he last shared knowledge for the pure joy of teaching? When had he shown kindness without expecting anything? In return, questions made him uncomfortable because he already knew the answers. Never, in his 127 years of existence, he had never once acted with the simple, uncomplicated goodness that seemed to define David Kim's daily life. The human had been insulted, dismissed, and treated with contempt by someone with the power to destroy planets. And his response had been to continue living with the same quiet dignity, the same gentle kindness, the same unwavering dedication to making his small corner of the universe a little bit better. Prince Scifi had traveled millions of light years, expecting to find primitive beings who needed his superior wisdom and technology. Instead, he had found a teacher who had lessons to offer that no royal academy had ever taught him. For the first time in his long life, the prince felt something that shocked him to his core. Shame. Not shame for his technology or his power, but shame for how he had used them. Shame for the casual cruelty he had shown to someone who deserved respect. Shame for believing that advancement could be measured only in weapons and ships and conquered worlds. As David finished his shift and prepared to head home, Zephyrian made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. Tomorrow, he would do something he had never done in his entire royal existence. Tomorrow, he would apologize. On the 8th night since their first encounter, David arrived at the observatory to find Prince Zephyrian waiting for him in the parking lot. But this time, everything about the alien was different. The floating crown was gone. The elaborate robes had been replaced by simple, dark clothing that looked almost human. The prince stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his galaxy eyes fixed on the ground rather than looking down at everything around him. For the first time since David had met him, Zephyrian looked uncertain. "You came back," David said quietly, showing no surprise or hostility. He walked past the prince toward the observatory entrance, pulling his keys from his pocket with the same calm routine he'd followed for years. "I never left," Zephyrian admitted, his voice lacking the harmonic arrogance it had carried before. "I've been watching." David paused at the door and turned to look at him. "Watching what?" "You," the prince said simply. "Your life. The way you spend your days." He took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of worlds. David unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind him. It was an invitation without words, and after a moment's hesitation, the prince followed him into the familiar space filled with humming equipment and blinking lights. "Why?" David asked, as he began his nightly routine of checking the systems. His tone wasn't angry or suspicious, just genuinely curious. Zephyrian watched David's hands move across the control panels with practiced efficiency. "Because everything I said to you was wrong, not just factually, but morally."
"How so?"
The prince struggled to find words for feelings he'd never had to express before. "I've spent 8 days watching you live your life, and I've learned something that no Royal Academy ever taught me. Intelligence isn't just about technology. Wisdom isn't about how many star systems you control, and worth," he paused, searching for the right words, "worth isn't measured by what you can build or destroy." David continued his calibrations, but the prince could tell he was listening carefully. "What did you see?" "I saw you teach children about the wonders of the universe with more passion than I've ever felt for anything in my life. I watched you help people who couldn't give you anything in return. I saw you care for animals that will never understand what kindness means." Zephyrian's voice grew quieter. "I watched you come to work every night and tend to this equipment like it was the most important technology in the galaxy." "It is important," David said simply, adjusting a frequency setting. "To me, anyway. That's what I didn't understand before," the prince continued. "In my world, we measure everything by its impact on galactic civilization. Faster ships, bigger weapons, more territory. But you found meaning in things that have nothing to do with conquest or advancement." David finished his initial checks and turned to face Zephyrian fully. "You've traveled all this way just to tell me that?" The prince felt heat in his cheeks, an emotion his species rarely experienced. "I came to ask if you would teach me." "Teach you what?" "How to live like you do? How to find purpose in helping others? How to care about things that don't benefit you directly?" Zephyrian's voice cracked slightly. "How to be good without expecting anything in return." David was quiet for a long moment, studying the alien prince who had insulted him so thoroughly just over a week ago. "Why does it matter to you now?" "Because I've realized that in 127 years of existence, I've never once made someone's life better just because it was the right thing to do. I've never taught someone something purely for the joy of sharing knowledge. I've never shown kindness without calculating what I might get back." The prince's galaxy eyes met David's human ones. "You do all of those things every single day, and somehow that makes you more civilized than someone who commands entire star systems." David turned back to his equipment, but not in dismissal. He was thinking, "Would you like to help tonight?" "Don't know how to operate your systems. That's okay. I'll teach you." For the next several hours, Prince Zephyrian found himself learning to use what he had once dismissed as primitive human technology. David showed him how to adjust the telescope's position, how to interpret the signals they received, and how to log data that might not seem important but could become crucial years later. "This is a pulsar," David explained, pointing to a pattern on the screen. "It's a spinning neutron star that sends out regular pulses of radiation." We've been tracking this one for 3 years now. What's the point? Zephyrian asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. No, it's a fair question, David said with a slight smile. The point is that we're learning. Every signal teaches us something about the universe. Every night we listen is a night we might discover something amazing. But what if you never find anything? What if there are no alien signals to discover? David considered this seriously. Then we'll have spent our lives reaching out to the cosmos with hope and curiosity. We'll have built something beautiful, dedicated to the search for truth. We'll have inspired children to dream about the stars and ask big questions about their place in the universe. He paused in his work. That seems like a pretty good way to spend a life, even if we never get an answer back. The prince stared at him. You really believe that? I do. As the night wore on, Zephyrian found himself genuinely enjoying the work. There was something meditative about the careful attention required, something satisfying about maintaining equipment that had such an important purpose. For the first time in his long life, he was doing something that wasn't about power or politics or personal gain. David, he said, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside, I need to leave soon. My people will be expecting a report about Earth. David nodded, continuing to log the night's observations. What will you tell them? The truth that this planet should be protected and left alone until your species is ready for contact on equal terms. The prince paused. That humanity isn't primitive at all. You're just young. And there's a big difference between those two things. Thank you. No, Zephyrian said firmly. Thank you. You showed me something I didn't know I was missing. What's that? That the most powerful response to cruelty isn't anger or revenge. It's just continuing to be good. The prince gathered his simple robes around him. When I insulted you that first night, you could have argued with me. You could have tried to prove me wrong or defend your species. Instead, you just walked away. With your dignity intact was the most devastating response you could have given. David finally looked up from his work. I wasn't trying to devastate you. I just didn't see any point in arguing with someone who had already made up his mind. That's exactly what made it so powerful. As they prepared to part ways, Zephyrian felt something he'd never experienced before, genuine gratitude toward someone who had given him nothing but knowledge and patience. Will I see you again? David asked. Probably not, the prince admitted. But I'll remember everything you taught me. And maybe someday, when your species is ready, we'll meet again as equals. Like that. Prince Zephyrian walked toward his ship, which shimmered into visibility as he approached. Before entering, he turned back one final time. David, yeah, keep listening to the stars. Someday they'll listen back. The ship lifted silently into the morning sky. David returned to his work unchanged by the encounter, but somehow validated by it. He'd learned that first contact didn't require grand gestures or profound speeches. Sometimes it just required being authentically human and trusting that goodness. Patience and quiet dignity were universal languages that even alien royalty could learn to understand. The stars continued their ancient dance above him. David Kim continued his quiet vigil below, listening for voices in the cosmic dark, knowing now that some of them might even be listening back, learning what it is truly meant to be civilized.